The majority of young Brits wants to be closer to the EU, but the government is hardly doing anything about the unpleasant consequences of Brexit. Not even the Labour opposition. But why? Great Britain is isolating itself. The United Kingdom is not an exception even for the younger generation. When the EU Commission offered the British government an agreement last week that would have given young people freedom of movement to study and work on both sides of the English Channel for 4 years, the Commission was quite rebuffed. Freedom of movement ended with Brexit, said the British government, and it will stay that way. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, like the previous governments of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, has no interest in concluding agreements with the EU. If so, please only with the selected individual EU countries. The Commission wanted to forestall this cherry-picking by the British government with its proposal, but their plan has failed so far. What was astonishing was that even opposition leader Keir Starmer from the Labour Party rejected the offer of freedom of movement for young people between the ages of 18 and 30. He also insists on the red lines that should not be crossed in the discussion about Brexit. According to his reading, the United Kingdom should not return to the EU internal market, should not go back into the EU customs union, and should not accept freedom of movement for workers. Labour does want to enter into closer cooperation with the EU, but so far it's only about things like a veterinary agreement to facilitate trade. Mutual recognition of professions could also be made easier, and orchestras and rock bands could be allowed to organize concerts without complex visa procedures. However, all of this is currently failing due to Great Britain's status as a third country. Labour's reluctance may come as a surprise. After all, according to a study by market researchers Redfield and Wilton, which was published for the organisation UK in a Changing Europe in February, 55% of Brits are in favour of rejoining the EU. Only 36% would stick to Brexit, and 8% are unsure. The picture is particularly pronounced among young people. Around 64% of young people between the ages of 18 and 24 who were not allowed to take part in the Brexit referendum in 2016 would prefer membership in the EU. Only among people over 65 do a majority support Britain remaining outside the EU. Around 55% of Britons are in favour of a referendum on re-entry in the next 5 years. The reason for the change in mood is easy to see. It came at a time when Boris Johnson and his successor Liz Truss stepped down and the consequences of Brexit were no longer obscured by the COVID pandemic. Although the British government has so far been able to delay some of the unpleasant consequences of Brexit, the public has realized that the promises of Brexit have not been fulfilled. In talk shows, the audience often laughs disparagingly at the topic of Brexit, and the negative headlines are increasing. There are no trade agreements with the USA or Canada. Prices in Great Britain are rising not only because of the general energy crisis and supply problems in the world, but also because of the complicated trade with the EU. To ensure that imports do not become even more expensive, the London government has kind of delayed the controls on medium risk class animal and plant products, which should also have been introduced on April 30th. The checks have already been postponed 5 times, and if the checks are introduced later this year, many medium-sized suppliers in the EU are likely to decide not to order the expensive veterinary certificates for deliveries to the UK. Product diversity in the UK will continue to shrink, and not only that, the British, who have often experienced traffic jams before crossing to France, know that from October onwards they will be required to have fingerprints and facial recognition when entering the Schengen area. Then the EU, and that in this case means often France, requires that all non-EU citizens must have provided their biometric data once before crossing the English Channel, and the app, which is intended to simplify the procedure, will not be ready for use by then. The consequences of Brexit do not need to be explained anymore, and the British hear it every day. Anyone who goes to the pharmacy to pick up their medicine will sometimes be told that the medication was not delivered. Medicines are also missing in EU countries, of course, but in Britain the situation is more serious because the country is no longer part of the EU process under which medicine is distributed across the EU. The Union, on the other hand, appears on the market with much greater purchasing power, and this means they can also buy medicines more cheaply, and the list could be extended indefinitely. Much remains unsaid, including the government's decision to silently comply with numerous EU trade rules, because otherwise the industry would no longer be able to export its produce to the EU in the long term. But why isn't the Labour opposition more committed to EU rapprochement, or at least do simply agree to something like the youth programme offered by the Commission, and would thus give young Brits the chance to simply study or work in an EU country for a few years? And there's a reason. 2/3 of Labour voters want Great Britain to rejoin the EU. But when asked what that means in concrete terms, the arguments no longer apply. British election expert John Curtis, professor at the University of Strathclyde, shows how contradictory the views are. According to a survey, 44% of Labour voters would like it if the United Kingdom complied with EU regulations so that food trade would be made easier. But more than a third of EU supporters and Labour voters also want Great Britain to stick to its own regulations. But that cannot be combined with membership in the EU. The same with electrical goods, where less than half of EU supporters in the UK think the UK should follow EU regulations. At the same time, well over a third of EU supporters and Labour supporters want Britain to go its own way. And similarly, on the issue of mobility for youth, around 51% of people who want to see Britain back within the EU support freedom of movement for young people. But 34% of EU supporters are against it, and 43% of them are Labour voters. So they still don't know what it means. The only exception is the issue of workers who work in the health system and care sector and are currently hired from outside Europe, thus driving up migration numbers. Here, more than 60% of British EU supporters would like their government to accept the professional qualifications and, of course, the help of EU workers. And all of this explains why opposition leader Keir Starmer and his shadow cabinet are cautious about speaking out about the EU. Starmer has to keep his feet still until the election because he needs voters who would like to be a member of the EU again, but who have not thought through the consequences. It may be that you can convince all the people who now have contradictory views in the long run, says Curtis, but it will be a big challenge for Labour if the party really wants to push through a kind of softer Brexit. The British public's instincts may therefore be correct. Only 30% of the public believe Britain will apply for new EU membership in the next decade, and around 37% of Brits assume that this is unlikely. And the latter could be very right. And it's still amazing. We all remember that on the day after the referendum, millions of people started to Google what is the EU. And they still don't know. Even the supporters who say we want Britain to rejoin the EU don't have a clue what it means to do that. And unless they are more educated about the EU, there will be no view of the people that really can, mirror reality, so to speak. Nevertheless, if you want to know more, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.